thank you again so much for joining us today. I want to jump right into things. Now, we've seen a lot of big changes in the gaming landscape. There's a lot more demand, a lot more gamers out there today, but we've also seen a rise kind of in entertainment companies like Disney, Hasbro, right? Bringing a lot of their IPs into gaming. So I want to kind of see, what have you been seeing on that kind of front? Have you been seeing a lot more gaming studios kind of working with these big entertainment companies? How's that look from your side?
Sure, yeah. So we've been doing media company to game licensing since the mid early 2000s. And one of our clients had the one of the largest licensing game of that period, and we're fortunate to continue to support that client today with other projects. But during that period, there was really a race to get users to try out mobile games. They typically were not on touchscreens at that time. There was still early days. There was a real race to get Snoopy, Disney characters, other characters from film and TV into games. And at that time, exclusivity was an important part of the equation, because in order to really get the value from that license agreement, the game developers, which we represented, typically wanted to see that guarantee of exclusivity. So over the last 20 years, the market has changed quite considerably. There was a period of time when, after that huge rush to get up to all these characters and other IPs into games, there was a period of time when it seemed like the market was saturated, and the media, the IP owners, the studios were less willing to grant exclusivity, or they weren't able to grant exclusivity anymore because they already had other licensees out there. And so the value of having licensed in IP in a game definitely diminished during that period. Then what's happened in recent years is that user acquisition costs, which, have always been high, but have just been on an upward trend, I think probably without interruption since mobile became a thing. User acquisition costs, I read somewhere, can't verify this, but I read somewhere that the average user acquisition cost is now $29 for a mobile game. So as user acquisition costs increased, and as game development costs increased, then we have game developers that are looking to manage their risk and to also reduce their user acquisition cost through, again, licensing an IP that people already know, that they're familiar with. Perhaps there's, going to be some portion of their existing fan base for that IP that's going to migrate pretty easily into the game or give the game a try. So that has certainly been a trend over the last several years. And it does seem now that, despite that kind of rethinking, let's say, on the part of game developers several years ago about the value of licensing IP, that definitely has continued to thrive and seems to be increasing as well these days.
And I got to ask too, you mentioned you've been kind of doing this since about, the mid 2000s as far as this, licensing with other game companies and IPs. What's sort of the end goal now for a company like Disney, right? I've seen a lot of, Disney, working with games like Fortnite, right? Where they have, you can get Darth Vader in Fortnite now as a skin. What's sort of the end goal for a company like Disney?
Good question. So what I just spoke to really was from the licensee side, which is the game developers. From the licensor side, which is film and TV IP owners, studios. They, of course, are seeing increasing threats to their core business, to traditional media channels, and obviously increased engagement among younger audiences in games. And so they certainly want to see their IP reaching those younger demographics, and gaming seems to be really a critical way to reach those people. So from the licensor perspective, that's certainly an important factor.
Where does that relationship usually start? So you kind of mentioned like there's the licensor and the licensee. Is it game developers who are more often than not, or publishers even more often than not, going to like a company like Disney and saying, "Hey, we want your characters in our game," or is it kind of vice versa, or is it a little bit of both?
What we have always seen has been the game developers approaching the publishers. Now, in the case of very large game developers approaching the IP owners, the film and TV studios, um, it certainly could be the case where, very large game developers that have really long-standing relationships with certain IP owners are perhaps more collaborative in planning out a roadmap for use of different characters or IP in games to be developed by that
Mhm.
developer going forward. But from our perspective anyway, just due to the nature of our practice, perhaps typically we do see a term sheet being provided by the game developer to the film and TV studio with a proposal for licensing.
You mentioned before you've been doing this, since the mid 2000s. Has there been sort of any major challenges or roadblocks to some of these game publishers in getting, these big license names, characters, stories, whatever it may be, incorporated into their games versus some more traditional fields like film or TV? How do the challenges kind of differ for these game companies?
So I would say from the licensor perspective, the film and TV studios, approval rights are a really important factor, and the ability to have review rights as the game is developed and the plans are put together. Um, no IP owner wants their characters that they have invested so much in and perhaps have over decades built a very strong fan base. They don't want those characters to be portrayed in a way that perhaps could alienate their fans, or perhaps could poison the well, let's say, for their continued use of the character. And this is a closely negotiated part of most any film and TV to games license agreement, as well as the other way around. And we work on both sides of this. It's often, apart from the economic rights, it could be the most closely negotiated part of a license agreement in this context. And the complications here are many. One of which is that if the IP is going from film and TV, which is of course a linear medium, to games, which is an interactive medium, then and particularly in a Web3 type of game, you could have the character, the user have the ability to cause the character to say things or take actions or behave in a certain way that is off brand from the perspective of the IP owner. We've had a situation where this was actually a reverse license from a game company to film and TV, but we had a situation where the producer, the licensee, which had licensed the content from our client, the game company, they decided to cause one of the characters to have a sort of change of gender identity. And the game developer, that didn't really fit with the sort of plans that the developer had for that character going forward. So it certainly raised some complication in terms of, their future use of that character in different types of, game kind of scenarios. So that's one example. I mean, an extreme example could be if the licensee causes a character to ultimately be killed off, which is more likely, of course, to be the case in a license to film and TV from a games company. In that case, the games company is going to be in quite a difficult situation if they intend to continue using that character in future productions. So these are sorts of things that have to be thought through quite carefully, and the expectations of both parties need to be properly reflected in the license agreement.
I mean, it's obvious that these characters and these stories and entertainment to video games obviously have a lot of value. And one thing that I'm curious about is, how does a company look at the characters that it has in a video game, or a company like Disney look at, say, a character like Darth Vader when they're in these contract negotiations to say, hey, you want Darth Vader in your game. Here's the price for that. How do these companies value something like that, like a Darth Vader as a character? What are some kind of benchmarks that they use to value what a character is worth to essentially sell or license?
I think that's a little bit outside of my specialty area, but I would expect that it's principally a matter of market conditions at that time in the license market, in the games market, and the perceived value of that character in in a high quality game. So, I mean, ultimately, valuation of creative works is there are professionals, of course, that do this, but we're in a situation currently. It's not specifically licensing to games, but it involves musical works that have been put on social media, um, and allegedly without the consent of the music publisher.
Hmm.
And some of these are quite valuable songs, but there's perhaps 5-second, 10-second excerpts appearing on social media platforms.
Hmm.
And it's just very, very difficult to establish any sort of valuation. You can sort of work backwards from, what's the cost of synchronization rights for the entire song, but that has its own challenges. And the same applies in the case of, a character, let's say like Darth Vader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, super, super interesting stuff. Now, why kind of right now are we seeing, you kind of mentioned before, in recent years, there's been kind of a big boom towards this licensing. Is there any sort of innovations that have come from sort of the legal side now that are making licensing more scalable for game studios?
I would say that certainly over the period that we have been in this space and drafting these agreements and negotiating these agreements, there has emerged a sort of standard across, the various terms like indemnity, let's say, definition of net revenue, for example, that may serve as the basis for royalty calculations, and a number of other contract terms that just by virtue of having, so many hundreds, thousands of these agreements been negotiated over the last 20 years since the market really emerged, that has certainly introduced some efficiency into the process. Now, something else that has happened here in the last few years as we've had these subscription services evolve, cloud-based subscription services, particularly with the larger incumbent mobile platforms, the royalty calculation has largely been taken out of the agreement. And the royalty calculation can often be a very complex and time-consuming part of getting a license agreement done, of course. But what we've had is these large platforms or services that are offering subscription game models to their users. We've had them come back to the developers and say, listen, don't worry about how we're going to calculate your revenue share, your royalty. It's going to be done considering the following 5 factors: user engagement, number of, users accessing the game, gameplay time, a number of factors that go into this algorithm, which we're not going to share with you, but trust us, you're going to be fairly compensated. And many developers that are eager to establish a foothold in this space, and have a spot in a subscription portfolio, are willing to go ahead and give these models a try. So simply by essentially, deferring to the determinations of the royalties made by the licensees, we have had a situation where that simplifies the negotiation of the license agreement.
Now, gaming has obviously changed a lot over the last 20, 30 years now, pretty much. When I was growing up, it was just kids playing in their mom's basement, Halo, all these different games. And now there's a community behind it, right? There's a huge community. We see these esports events where there's, tens of thousands of people in an arena watching something like League of Legends, right? Do you think that there's an opportunity in the future for some of these big esports teams to kind of get the same licensing deals that almost like these NFL and NBA teams have? I mean, just any kind of sports league is doing this. Do you think there's an opportunity in the gaming world that we could see in the future?
Well, certainly the kind of premier esports organizations have been very active almost since the start in terms of building their own brand and then integrating other other brands into their ecosystems. I have no doubt that these esports organizations have been exploring this and would love to see that, but there are some challenges that don't exist in the context of traditional sports. For one thing, you don't have this kind of um, sort of league infrastructure that you have in the case of traditional sports like the NFL, where licensing could be done on a broad kind of basis, perhaps with the players union, let's say, or at the league level in some cases. In esports, we still have really a sort of fractionalized kind of environment with each esports organization essentially on its own and, really competing, let's say, perhaps with other esports organizations for high quality licensing opportunities. And we also have the challenge that in esports, the organizations, which means the teams, they they don't own the game. The game is owned by another party, a game publisher, which may have entirely different kind of objectives with respect to licensing. So that's certainly a different challenge in the case of esports.
Video games are very technology focused, and one thing that has been huge for a lot of investors right now is this idea of blockchain technology. And when we talk about IPs and blockchain, we're talking a lot about Web3 and NFTs. Now, how have those two factors, have they reshaped kind of IPs in video game licensing? Is the legal foundation here still a little too shaky for investors or, kind of game companies to look at NFTs and Web3 tech to license this IP yet? Or where do you think we're at for that technology right now?
Well, so we've been in this space really since the early days, and just personally, I've been really committed to seeing blockchain develop in the game space. I think there's so many interesting opportunities. And what you just mentioned in terms of the ability of blockchain to simplify licensing, and it's not just in games, it can be in pretty much any creative area, and simplify royalty collection, simplify and expand distribution. There's so many great things that could come from blockchain integration with, and development of markets for licensing of IP. We have seen some companies that have tried to build something to begin to create a kind of ecosystem for, licensing through blockchain technology. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much progress develop or adoption on the scale that is necessary for this really to get traction at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
My hope is that, certainly as we've seen over the last several months, a really kind of new life that's come into, crypto writ large, that with time, there will be more attention and more investment made in models such as licensing on the blockchain. And I hope that happens.
One thing we know is that video games are now global, right? It's not a US thing, it's not a China thing, right? So many different countries across the world are playing video games. When it comes to these licensing deals, are there any changes that go across borders, right? Is there a deal that gets made for the US version of a game, in one place and then in another country like China? Do the deals typically change on what's included or things that are taken out, or are they usually the same across the world?
There are regional concerns that need to be addressed in terms of, violence, let's say, or presentation of characters. Obviously, you have language. There's localization that needs to be done in many regions. But you also have a situation where very often if it's an international deal, and we do quite a lot of these, particularly with Japan, where you may have IP that's coming from Japan. And very often the IP has already been licensed within Japan. So there's existing license deals in certain territories. Maybe it's Japan and China, Southeast Asia. And so those territories need to be carved out from the grant of the license. In my experience, it's quite unusual to see a kind of global deal that doesn't have some sorts of carve outs or conditions.
Do you feel like this licensing in gaming sort of phenomenon that's going on right now is undervalued to investors? And what I mean by that is a lot of investors and big companies are not really paying attention to it right now, especially as a means to profit. Or do you feel like it's overhyped? Like too many companies are starting to do it and it's getting oversaturated?
From my perspective, this segment, um, gaming, is just going to continue to grow. We certainly are seeing, gaming expanding its reach, and the kind of traditional thinking of games as sort of first person shooters is long outdated at this point. We have, I think, very interesting games developing that are based on a collaborative sort of format, and games, sandbox types of games. We've seen a number of these over the last few years, particularly since COVID, that have really been quite successful and attracted new types of audiences, let's say a larger female demographic to games. So, in some of these games, there may not be real well-defined objectives. There may not be kind of a mission that needs to be accomplished or a quest. It may be more about the interactivity and the social aspect. So from my perspective, and I think the economics support this, from the perspective of licensors, games are going to continue to be, and more and more are going to be an important segment that they need to be actively getting their IP into, reaching a younger generation, as discussed earlier, as well as just expanding the reach of their IP.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my next question here too, of where do you see the landscape going next in the next kind of decade, right? You mentioned kind of seeing more of these deals. What do these deals kind of look like? And I guess what should investors kind of pay attention to? If I'm looking to invest in a company like Disney, for example, should I expect that to become, a larger part of their revenue stream and a bigger thing that's going to be talked about, especially when it comes to video games? What does the next decade look like for gaming and licensing?
I think with AI, we have the opportunity to expand even further the value and importance of games as people are increasingly able to really have a personalized experience within a game environment. And that's going to lead, I think, to more and more opportunities for licensing from the likes of large incumbents like Disney, as well as smaller IP owners as well. The challenge, of course, is going to be, as we mentioned earlier in this discussion, maintaining the integrity of that IP and making sure that from the licensor's perspective, that the IP, the characters, are not sort of negatively affected by the freedom that users will have to make their own story and perhaps cause the characters to behave in a certain way and take certain actions. But I think really the integration of AI into games, it's there's so much incredible potential to expand this segment. And I think that any IP owner would be foolish not to, really be taking a careful look at how they expand their presence within the game segment. So certainly over the next 10 years, that is going to be a huge factor. I think, and I may be a bit optimistic in this respect, but I think that Web3 is going to become an increasingly important factor as well. And ownership of in-game assets, user-generated content, we've already seen is really you could say it's really what's built the internet, not just in games, but the social media and so forth. And my expectation and my hope is that there's going to be more opportunities for users to actually own and share in the value that is produced by user-generated content that they produce. And certainly Web3 is the most obvious way that that's going to happen.
A lot of exciting stuff, a lot of opportunities out there. Thank you so much for joining us, David, and lending your expertise for today.
Thank you. My pleasure.